All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome to the second CRC Roundtable. It's a monthly virtual seminar series, and our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. These webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. Each seminar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics in order to build connectivity between all of us and increase our collective competency for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists have only been given about 6 to 8 minutes each to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion. This is all about us, the community, giving a place to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future we want. So why this topic at this time by these speakers? And Lauren, if you could advance the slides to this. Between protest against systemic racism to the social ramifications related to the COVID-19 pandemic, discussions around environmental justice have illuminated things once invisible to many of us, myself included. Why this time? Because once we have those glasses that allow us to see, things become visible in so many places. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as in so much of the country, many lower income communities, people of color, or minority groups are disproportionately affected by environmental threats, placing an unequal health burden on the people living there. Environmental justice refers to the efforts to change that. Why these speakers? Can you go to the next slide, Lauren? They represent a range of scales in which they grapple with infusing environmental justice into Chesapeake Bay restoration, from EPA Region 3 to the Chesapeake Bay program to communities and grassroots efforts. And you can see the order of the speakers here. Go to the next slide, Lauren. The webinar ground rules for the attendees are here. We will place those in the chat box so you have a reminder of them. And let me state the obvious, that environmental justice is a topic that is wide and deep, and this webinar is intended to simply take a first step into the pool. Future webinars are already planned to explore specific dimensions in more detail, and I'll talk about a list of those and ask for your contributions at the end of the webinar. Each of our panelists have extensive experience, and I'm sure each of them could fill an hour all by themselves. But we've asked them to limit their remarks to a very short time period, and that is a challenge. Panelists, I will try to gracefully, as much as I can, let you know when you are at the 6-minute mark. If you have material that you are unable to share because of that time limit, we will find a way to either make your slides or additional remarks available to all the attendees. The most important part of this hour is the opportunity for attendees to be able to ask the brave and clumsy questions. So panelists, please help me do that. Next slide, Lauren. Lastly, you will hear a diversity of terms today, and we are all learning the language and refining it as we go. Here are some brief definitions that were helpful to me. We will place them in the chat box as well for reference. And with that, let me turn over the virtual floor to our first panelist, Reggie Harris.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm trying to share my screen and I don't know if it's working. Do you see it? Do you all see my screen yet?
Yes.
Oh, you can? Okay. All right. So let me zip through this very quickly. Going to give you a quick overview on environmental justice. Going to roll through this really fast. Environmental justice is, as defined by EPA, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. By defining environmental justice, we have a term called meaningful involvement that we use. And meaningful involvement means that people have an opportunity to participate in decisions about activities that may affect their environment and or health. The public's contributions can influence the regulatory agency's decision. Their concerns will be considered in decision-making process, and decision makers seek out and facilitate the involvement of those potentially affected. Now, by meaningful involvement, the diagram that you see there speaks for itself. We have equality, we have equity, and we have justice. And if you look at the three little diagrams there, you can see clear representations of each, where if in equality, you treat everybody the same way. The result might not be the same for each, but you treat them the same way. Equality, you give people an equal playing field. And then with justice, you make it so that everyone has the opportunity to participate as is important and is appropriate for them. I'll skip some of this and go on. An example, Woodland Village was an unincorporated subdivision in the Indian Head, Maryland. I use this because it's in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It's a small community down in Indian Head that was formed in 1940 for minority workers to work at the Naval Warfare Center at Indian Head. Those workers were not provided with appropriate amenities. They didn't have the same drinking water and clean water facilities that other people in the community had. And mind you, Woodland Village is completely surrounded on all four sides by Indian Head. So it is within Indian Head. It was not, like a separate little subdivision. And what happened in 1998, some people came to us along with the city manager and told us about the problems they were having with clean water and drinking water. And through our efforts, then Governor Glendening was able to fund appropriation bill that provided them with new drinking water and clean water services. And one of the interesting things about that was that their drinking water, their clean water was discharging directly into the Mattawoman River, which is a tributary that leads to Chesapeake Bay. So that's an FYI. What can we do? In Region 3, we're able to utilize tools such as EJ Screen. And here are 3 maps depicting the use of multiple types of information from multiple sources to characterize and help people to understand communities. Here's the redlining map from the city of Philadelphia from 1938, overlaid by childhood blood lead levels, and the EJ Screen areas of environmental concern. And you can see that there is very strong correlation between the 3. Now, EJ Screen is a GIS-based tool which has nationally consistent EJ screening data that is used to help us identify where vulnerable populations may be disproportionately impacted by pollution. It's quick to note that the information in EJ Screen is used for informational purposes and to help you to understand communities better and more appropriately address communities. It is not a decision-making tool, among of other things that I don't have time to talk about now. But I guess the basic take-home messages are that there are 11 EJ indexes that are used, including, environmental factors plus the demographics, that it's annually updated, that we do have tools that, the tool works down to the block group level. It's web accessible by anyone, and there is ability to download raw data. Don't have time to talk about this, but EJ Screen can be used for public outreach and engagement, enforcement, targeting, inclusion and inspection reports, permitting and NEPA reviews, review of grant projects, other types of place-based initiatives, and inclusion in various databases that we have, as well as retrospective reporting. But I think the most important thing is that it can help you to understand communities better. We've done a lot of assessments, and if people need help and need assessments, Matthew Lee in our office, lee.matt@epa.gov, is the person you can reach out to. He's done more than 8,000 EJ screens, and he's a national expert in the field. And now finally, to answer the question, what keeps me up at night? The fact that we have to continually have these conversations about environmental justice and these issues. That's what keeps me up at night. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful, Reggie. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I know that was a lot to fit into the time frame. And we'll move on to Jim Edward.
Jim, will you be sharing your own screen?
No, no, Lauren, could you do that for me?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So thanks, Denise, appreciate that. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be here today. In addition to my role as Deputy Director of the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office, and perhaps more importantly, I'm the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Program Diversity Work Group, and I've been the chair since 2015. The Bay Program Partnership is a multi-state, multi-federal agency partnership that's been in existence since 1983. So it's, a long-standing program, which, it's well-respected, nationally and internationally, but also, is fairly set in its ways. So bringing diversity into the program and considering environmental justice and other DEIJ issues has been a challenge. The program has been around since 1983, so over 30 years. We operate by a series of what are called Chesapeake Bay agreements. They're signed by the governors of the Bay States, the EPA administrator representing the federal government, and the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. So they sort of guide our work, typically for, a 5 or 8 year period. It could be as much as 10. There's been, like I said, 4 of those. The first one was signed in 1987. And the most recent one is the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, which was signed in 2014. And the reason I'm giving you some of this history is that means that in the 2014 agreement, for the first time, we addressed diversity and environmental justice. So that means it, took 27 years of, multiple agreements to guide this program, and with goals and outcomes and specific targets. And only after 27 years did the program finally include diversity and environmental justice. And it was not without some struggles along the way, although we had lots of public comments supporting that we address both issues. Probably some of the folks on the phone today from EJ Act and other folks in the region who were very active. If you could just go back one slide, I just wanted to highlight. So in the agreement that I just mentioned, there's a diversity outcome and an EJ principle. Outcome is to identify stakeholder groups that are not currently represented in the leadership, decision-making, and implementation of conservation and restoration activities, and create meaningful opportunities and programs to recruit and engage them in the partnership's efforts. So it's not just engagement, but get them engaged and involved in leadership and decision-making as well. Have them have diverse and underrepresented communities at the table, contributing to decision-making. The EJ principle, there's a set of principles that guide the agreement, about 10 of them, and environmental justice is one of them. Sounds very close to the definition of EJ that Reggie presented in his presentation, but it's promote environmental justice with the meaningful involvement and fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income in the implementation of this agreement. So next slide. So following the agreement, we formed a diversity work group, which I imagine a number of folks on the call are on that. It consists of not just, state and federal agency members, but lots of other stakeholders and partners from around the watershed, including representatives from communities of color and other underrepresented groups. And coming out of that work for the diversity work group, they felt that it was really important that we have an independent review of our DEIJ efforts for the Bay Program Partnership. So we, EPA funded a project and awarded it to an independent consultant, SKIO Solutions, who does a lot of work in the DEIJ space. They conducted in the last year and a half what they call a readiness assessment of the Bay Program's DEIJ work through a series of interviews, focus groups, surveys, and reviewed our existing policy and governance documents. They then drafted a DEIJ strategy with a whole series of recommendations that they made to the partnership, and that was finalized this past spring in April. So it was good to have that independent outside look at what we were doing on diversity and environmental justice and get recommendations on how to improve that. Next slide, please. So coming out of that, three things on the left is actually the strategy itself, called Restoration from the Inside Out. It's about 60 pages long, has 20 recommendations with almost 50 specific actions that fit within those recommendations, so very thorough document. And then two other documents that I'll talk about. And it's of some significance is that the Chesapeake Executive Council, which again is the governor's and EPA administrator, signed a DEIJ statement in August of this year at their annual meeting. This had been one of the recommendations in the strategy, and we had actually had it in the works. I would like to believe that it would have happened if what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor had not happened, but unfortunately it probably that helped contribute to the ability to get all the governors, all 7 governors to sign it and the EPA administrator. So we do have this statement. I think it's very significant in the sense that in addition to the Bay agreements that are signed that I mentioned that only happen every few years, the Executive Council rarely signs another document and hadn't signed anything other than an agreement in over a dozen years. So this is significant in that sense that we got that sort of top management support and commitment from the highest levels in the states and the federal government for DEIJ.
Jim, you're at 6 minutes.
Okay. All right. The next slide, I'm sorry, the next document is, well, I'll just walk through. Oh, can you go back a second, Lauren, just real quick, because I'm not going to be able to go through that one. The next document there, our principal staff committee, which state secretaries also signed a statement on that same day in August that had more specifics in it. It's called an action statement and laid out 5 specific charges for us to undertake in the next couple of years. So just next slide. Some things I just wanted to highlight from the ECDEIJ statement was, just some of the key wording, the second bullet there on, including DEIJ in our policies, strategic goals, and on our guidance on environmental justice criteria and grant targeting and evaluations. That's an issue that's been raised by the diversity work group, is some inequity in how grants are awarded and distributed throughout the Bay watershed. And so it was good to get that language in there. Next slide. This was much negotiated language here. The impacts of discrimination, continued environmental, economic, and health disparities disproportionately burden underserved communities. And these disparities are only exaggerated by such factors as climate change and pollution and public health emergencies like COVID-19. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So from the action statement, two things, and I'll probably close with this. So within 6 months, we have to develop an implementation plan to present back to the principal staff committee. And that development of the plan calls for inclusion of outreach to underrepresented communities for input and feedback. And we really want to make that happen in a legitimate way. And the second is within 3 months, exploring a process for developing a community advisory board composed of EJ leaders and representatives from organizations led by people of color and other represented groups. And this will be consistent with sort of the other advisory committees we have in the Bay program for Citizens Advisory Committee, Local Government Advisory Committee, and a Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. And they sit at the table at all of our senior meetings, management board, and principal staff committee. So that would be significant, something we really want to get stakeholder input on. And I think I'll close there. I have a couple of other slides on a DEIJ dashboard that we're developing that builds off of the EJ screen document. Just go to the next slide real quick, and then I'll just close. So that's something else that's under development right now that we're working with the diversity work group on. So I will just close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and I appreciate that. I just made you describe 30 years worth of work in 8 minutes. But yeah, we'll move on. And the next speaker is Jay.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. And I am Jay Ford. I'm with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I work in our policy shop here in Virginia. And over the last couple of years, I've had really the privilege to get my hands into the nitty-gritty of environmental justice policy. The Commonwealth has had a couple of years, over the last 3 years, we've really seen rapid progress. So I'm going to do a recklessly fast overview of what Virginia has done over the last couple of years and maybe where we need to go in the next couple of years. But for us at the Bay Foundation, our relationship with environmental justice has really been evolving over the last few years. And we're at a place now where we don't really see a bright line where our work on bay restoration and environmental justice part ways. And that really comes down to it's a two-way street. In one way, we don't think you can get to a restored bay without the meaningful participation of all communities throughout the Bay watershed, and taking a hard look at some of these environmental justice challenges in communities around the watershed that have been traditionally unheard. They not only need to be heard, but they need to be addressed in order for us to meet our Bay cleanup goals. The other way of looking at that is if you get to a restored bay and you've left many communities behind, we view that increasingly as a failed objective. And so a restored bay needs to mean a restored bay for all persons in the bay watershed. And so that's really what's been bringing us into that work more and more. I would add that climate change has made environmental justice policy a paramount objective. The fact of the matter is if the states in the Bay watershed and quite frankly nationally don't get adequate environmental justice policies and processes on the books, then we are going to end up with another with really horrible outcomes as we start to address both sea level rise and the impacts of climate change. So putting these practices in place now, doing a better job in EJ outreach is really critical to making sure we're ready to address climate change. So for us, when we're looking at environmental justice in Virginia, there are a lot of tools we use. We use a number of different GIS tools. We use the EJ screen, NIMS, mapping tools, sea level rise, public health, all of these different data sets come together. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is we take the time to get into these communities and listen to people and hear what the emerging issues are. And that may sound glib, but I cannot overstate the importance of that. And that is really where we see regulators fall down. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But what ends up happening is, we write a permit or we write a policy, and the follow through on getting into these environmental justice communities isn't there. And it's not there for a lot of reasons. The primary one we'll talk about in a moment, but not being on the ground and having staff in place to have these conversations has been one of the major pitfalls in environmental justice implementation, really, in both Virginia and other states around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So here in Virginia, really starting at the very end of the McAuliffe administration, we've seen a rapid succession of both executive orders and legislation to try and do a better job. At the end of the McAuliffe administration, there was the creation of the first Environmental Justice Council. That council met for the first time in the December before he left office in the following January. So the work product of that group really fell onto the current administration, the Northam administration. And at that time, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was a major driver of the push for environmental justice in Virginia. And one of the ways to look at that EO from Governor McAuliffe was really as a pressure release valve, as their administration was catching a lot of grief. And I think that's important to point out, that there was the politics behind this, because at the end of the day, EOs are unfunded mandates. And so a lot of what has happened over the last couple of years has been highly reactive to on-the-ground conditions here in Virginia, but not, they haven't put their money where their mouth is yet in a number of ways, which we'll come back to. The second iteration of the Environmental Justice Council was created under an executive order by Governor Northam. This time, they brought in the scope of work a little bit and provided 5 objectives for the EJ Council to mull over. And I had the privilege to serve on this council and chair our policy work group, where we really did a deep dive into permits, procedures, policies, and sort of data gaps in Virginia and what was needed in order for us to continue forwarding environmental justice. We wrapped up our work in a report that was published this July, which I believe will be made available to you in the chat link. It's if you need something to help you ease your mind at the end of the day, this is not the document, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. A number of recommendations in there had to deal with cumulative impacts. And that is really going to be the next area that Virginia does a deep dive. And that's, how do we take all of these disparate permits that may all on their own be perfectly legal and within the bounds, and do an assessment on whether or not the community can really stand any additional pollution when you consider the totality of their permitted activities. And so I think that's going to be one of the main things we see in the coming months.
Jay,
Additionally,
I'm sorry, you're at about 7 minutes.
okay, let me wrap up then. So the most recent updates here in Virginia have been two things. One is the interagency task force, which is currently meeting now, and that was created during this session through budget language. And the other is the SKIO report that did a similar report for the state of Virginia Department of Environmental Quality that just came out last Friday. And that report announcement was coupled with the creation of an environmental justice director who will reside in DEQ. I'm out of time, but just to say what keeps me up at night, it's funding. It's all funding. Everything I've just listed was unfunded. The council, the interagency report, and even the EJ director, they're going to create that position from within the DEQ budget. And this is after DEQ has had money cut for water quality, air quality monitoring, and environmental justice communications. So that's what keeps me up at night is the saying in legislators is until it's in the budget, it's not real. And while Virginia has made huge strides over the last couple of years, until we're ready to put money on the table and to do the necessary outreach, we're not going to be adequately addressing the need. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. That was a great overview of a lot of activity. I do want to mention to people that resources that people mention and are contributing have been going by in the chat box. That whole list of resources will be made available to all of the attendees, as well as some answers to questions we don't get to after the webinar. So have no fear, we'll share those resources with you. And last but not least, Taylor Lilly, who is just a wonderful, I'm just so pleased that the Bay Foundation has an attorney to look after environmental justice issues. So I'll let her have the floor.
Thanks, Denise, and hello to everybody. So as Denise mentioned, I'm the environmental justice staff attorney for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'm actually the second iteration of that position, so still relatively new, but definitely has its footing within CBF and is definitely looking to be a permanent position within the organization. And just as a disclaimer, CBF is made up of so many organizations, so the way that we approach environmental justice that I'll be talking about today really relates to how I've been working within the litigation department and with our partners in the Environmental Protection and Restoration Department. And I'll just emphasize that within restoration and education, that approach to environmental justice might look different than the way that we might go about it in litigation, where we're developing relationships with communities and then moving forward possibly to a legal response. That's not necessarily the case in all environmental justice efforts. So today, just to keep it short, I thought I would show a couple of examples of some EJ work that we're doing and the data that we've used to go about this project. So Lauren, if you could advance the next slide. So this is a story map created by our GS department that mapped out all of the sanitary sewer overflows in Baltimore. For those of you who aren't familiar with the issue, essentially, Baltimore had set up its sewer system to operate off a system of outflows where excess sewage would run into the Bay, the Patapsco River, and Back River. And in closing up those outfalls, one of the outcomes was excess pressure on that sewer system. And so when it rains, all that water goes into this newly limited system and backs up into people's homes. So that means, yes, raw sewage was backing up into people's homes. And so we were hearing these stories, everyone was hearing these stories. It was becoming a very well-known issue within Baltimore and outside of it. And by mapping this, we're able to show not only ourselves internally, but our members and anyone else who is interested exactly how this problem was occurring and the way in which it was represented for communities. And you can kind of see the bigger dots are where there are more overflows. And if you play around with the map on our website a little bit, it shows you how many gallons and overflows that have happened throughout the city. And so this has been helpful, not only for us as we understand, you know, our backups occurring in one part of the city more than another. As you can see, Baltimore's sewer system is in some sense the great equalizer, but there are some areas that are experiencing more. The EJ aspect of this is that a lot of people are experiencing this differently and that they can't respond to it in the same way as everyone else in the city. So a person who is dealing with a lower income might not be able to make the same kind of overtures to clean up their basement backups as someone who has a lot more flexible income. Not to mention that if you put a claim in your homeowner's insurance to say, I've had a basement backup just one too many times, you no longer have homeowner's insurance. And so what we've seen a lot is people and community members going into each other's homes and attempting to clean up after a raw sewage backup. And probably the most important quote, and you can see in some of this parts of the map, there are quotes and stories from individuals. But one of the quotes from the public hearing was, how clean is really clean when you're doing it yourself. And so we can go on to the next slide. This is Portsmouth, Virginia, and this is an example of our use of EJ Screen. So we first encountered our community in Portsmouth through word of mouth. Our grassroots coordinators had a relationship with the community, and they knew that we were developing environmental justice responses in our litigation department. And so we sort of worked together to maintain this response. And when we went into the community, like Jay was mentioning, part of this EJ lawyering is also being a community lawyer. We drive everywhere in normal days, not obviously in COVID days, but usually I'm on the road talking to communities as much as I can. And so we heard about the issues in Portsmouth directly from community members' mouths, and they told us stories of their experience with Superfund sites and contamination and what they felt was wrong. And before we went down there, we didn't have any background on what was happening. And the problem with a lot of EJ is that the stories and the evidence is anecdotal. And so it's not necessarily taken seriously. But with tools like EJ Screen, as you can see here, you can sort of verify those stories. So you can see on one side is the Superfund proximity within Portsmouth. So Portsmouth and parts of Norfolk are registering in the 99th percentile for Superfund proximity. We've got about, I think it was 9 sites within a 15-mile radius, all on EPA's Superfund website. We've said that they're on the national priorities list. They are a problem. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And then over here on the right side, you can see the minority population representation. So this is an example of EJ Screen being perfect. It tells us exactly what we need to know, but this is unique. And EPA has notes on its website that EJ Screen has limitations. In this case, this data is really good and really trustworthy because those Superfund sites are registered by EPA. EPA is going to have that data, and Portsmouth is a metropolitan area. That data is going to be easily available. But in areas like Buckingham County, where ACP was having its environmental justice showdown, the Air Board found that there was no environmental justice community. They said that the population was 38% minority. When there was a door-to-door study done afterwards, it was actually around 63%. So that's to say that EJ Screen can be an extremely useful tool, but it should be taken with a grain of salt. And EPA has a really great page that notes the limitations of EJ Screen. And so while it definitely does its job as a highlighting tool, as Reggie said, it's not a decision-making tool. And that's something that we've advocated against at various regulatory levels when we've seen regulators say, well, there is no EJ issue. We use EJ Screen. It said there's no problem. Moving on, next part, we're done. And so just to try and keep this short, we'll go ahead to the next part. So this is actually something that was created by a community organization, Virginia River Healers, and these pictures were just available on Facebook. And so when we started this advocacy, we heard that there were these 2 gas plants coming to Charles City County, Virginia. I'm not from the area, and I'm sure even some people who are from the Bay region aren't necessarily aware of Charles City County, Virginia. It's very rural, predominantly African-American and low income. And we heard these stories from our grassroots advocates and from people that we're partnered with about these plants coming in. And they said they're very, very close to each other. They're going to be right around the corner, right around the road. But those descriptors don't really give you the picture. They can't really tell you exactly where the impact is, and it doesn't really bring it forward for you. And so this map shows how close C4GT and the proposed Chickahominy gas power station were to each other. I think the actual number is about 1.1 miles, but as you can see, there are some houses and businesses right in between that. And once again, most of this energy from both these stations was not going to this community. This wasn't in response to a direct need or advocacy from the community. It was largely going to be sold on the PJM interconnect. So this was going outside of the community itself. And then just one more advance, and I'll cut it off. This, in addition to getting these gas plants, Charles City County was also getting a pipeline to feed all of these gas plants. So this is an example. These are images that Virginia River Healers was able to provide that show exactly where the gas pipelines were going to go. And you can see on one side how close they're going to be to homes, and on the other, how they were directly cutting through not only forest land, but wetlands. And so images like these, while they're not ones that we necessarily presented to regulators when we're advocating for environmental justice decision-making to be a part of the process, they are very important for advocacy. because environmental justice for a lot of people, and it's also why we're having this conversation, can be kind of abstract. It's a new concept for some, it's a difficult concept for others, but visuals like this really help lay out the problem in a way that everyone can digest. And so I think that was 6 minutes. One of my first time ever doing environmental justice was in Mississippi, and they told me I talked too fast. So I'm sorry for all of that, if that was too quick, but hopefully we have enough time to talk about it now and I can go a little slower.
Oh, thank you very much, Taylor. And I especially appreciate the connection you've made between anecdotal stories and having a tool to document those. So we're going to enter the discussion period. I would tell people I will start off with a question to each of the panel members, and to give you time to formulate your questions, you are welcome to either unmute yourself and ask them in person, or you can put them in the chat box and we'll ask them in order and try to get to all of them. Just as a follow-up, what we did with the first webinar is we circulate any unanswered questions to the panel members, pull those responses and make them available to all of you. So hopefully all your questions get answered. Let me start off with this, because I heard the word unheard and heard and listened in all of the presentations. And so one of the questions I would like each of the panelists to maybe briefly respond to is that it seems to me that much of the existing work has highlighted listening as a critical part of addressing environmental justice, and the need to listen as much as talk. And so are there examples of how to be better listeners, good listeners in communities? And if you can't have an example that comes to mind, we can follow up with it. But let me just start, and maybe we'll go backwards through the panelists. If Taylor, if you know of examples, and then each of the panelists can chime in.
So I think the first example that comes to mind is, and I wasn't in attendance, so I hope anyone on the call who was in attendance can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was a relatively recent webinar done by Virginia DEQ back in June that focused on environmental justice, and there was an opportunity for community input in that space. And I think that conversation was actually led by Vernice Miller-Travis, who co-authored Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, and really facilitated a conversation where community members afterwards, telling me about this webinar, felt that they had an opportunity to share their concerns and speak to decision makers in a way that wasn't familiar to them. In our work, there's not really a tangible thing that I can immediately point to. It's really just a personal practice of, one, doing it incorrectly the first time and learning how to do it better the next time, and really actively making a decision not to speak as much as possible until after I've heard as much as anyone is willing to share, and then be as responsive as possible.
Jay, do you have an example? Because you talked quite a bit about listening.
Sure. You know, I guess first let me just say, when you're talking about regulatory bodies, I think it's really important to remind everyone, and no offense, Taylor, the regulatory bodies, their procedures were really written for and by attorneys. And so when you're thinking about, you know, a state water control board, you know, it's not meant for people to easily walk in there and be heard and to have a back and forth the ways that people are used to having a conversation about a topic. And that's a lot to pull back. And the regulatory agencies, I think, they recognize this issue. But when it comes to the question of listening, a lot of it's really twofold. And I'll use sea level rise as an example right now. Virginia is going through the development of this coastal master plan, and also for the first time participating in a RGGI auction. And those dollars are going specifically to coastal flood mitigation. We have so many environmental justice communities in low-lying areas in the south side of the bay, on the northern neck, and on the eastern shore, where I get to spend my days. And the state is finding it's not equipped to get into these communities to do the necessary listening. And so we're seeing some pretty out of the box solutions, but part of the problem is also now we're in the middle of COVID. And so as we're all looking at each other right now, these same communities that need to be heard have technological limitations that are really compounding communication difficulties. So I don't know if that's a good example, but it is part of the problem that we're facing right now.
Thanks, Jay. That's really helpful. Jim and Reggie, any brief examples or description of the challenges about listening?
Yeah, I'll try and chime in here. We had a diversity work group meeting for the Bay program about two plus years ago in Petersburg, Virginia. And it was near Virginia State University, historically Black college. And we had some state, work group members who attended from Virginia and elsewhere, or somewhere on the phone. And the bulk of the meeting was hearing from a panel of community members and community activists who talked about a lot of issues like lead paint poisoning and food deserts, and a lot of issues that I think left a lot of our state diversity work group members, scratching their heads and like, well, what does this have to do with water quality in the Chesapeake Bay? But it really was an outstanding discussion. Eventually, we got around to talking about flooding and some of those issues in their homes and what caused that, and stormwater, and, but it really took a lot of listening on our part and hearing sort of the whole breadth of what they're dealing with in terms of public health and income and socioeconomic issues. So you've got to really listen and, go out to the communities and be with them. Like, we've always had our meetings at places that have public transportation and that sort of thing, and not come to the Bay program in Annapolis and see the pretty water. It's, you've got to go to the communities where they live and listen to them. So that would be one of my examples.
Thank you, Reggie. Do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the other questions?
Sure. Most things have already been said, but to sum up very quickly, I think that it's important that we respect people, and respecting them, having respect, giving respect, and meeting them where they are, accepting them as they are, and listening to what they say for the value that they bring and the experiences that they have, the wealth of experiences and understanding of their communities, of themselves, and of their surroundings, and using that to help us move forward. In Chester, Pennsylvania, back in 1993, the people told us that they were concerned about a variety of impacts associated with facilities in their community. There were a number of hazardous waste facilities there in Chester, and they felt that they were being disproportionately impacted by, all of those facilities and all of the releases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we went into that community, and this is something for Jay, FYI. We did a cumulative risk study back in 1993 in Chester, and we included public health data, environmental data, et cetera, and took a look at all of the things that were impacting that community. And by us listening and doing that, the return that we got was tremendous, because we have advocates down in Chester in that community, number one. Number two, they started their own environmental work group down there called the Chester Environmental Partnership that works to address and solve local problems. So I'm giving you some of both ends of that. Thank you.
That's wonderful. I've gotten a couple questions in the chat box. The first one is a great question. It's from Patrick Diarmi. Much of bay restoration work is focused and funded on reducing nutrient pollution. What is the relationship between that effort and the EJ initiatives and goals described today? And panelists, just go ahead and unmute yourself, and if you can respond to that question, that would be really helpful. There's got to be a taker.
Well, okay, I'll start because I mean I want to ask a question back on this one. So you want to know what the relationship is between EJ efforts and goals described today. Well, what are some of the outcomes that come out that could potentially come out of reducing nutrient pollution in the bay? What are some of the benefits for the people?
This is Patrick. That was my question, and I also have the same question that you are asking right now, Mr. Harris, because my question, I guess, a lot of the things we talked about today was like toxic pollutions, hazardous materials, and that type of stuff, and much of that I feel isn't actually addressed, like in the federally funded bay restoration movement, because of the, some might say, singular focus on nutrient trading. So I guess my real question is like, how can we make sure that there isn't like, you know, we're actually considering how that focus on just reducing nutrient pollution may not be addressing all of the equity and environmental justice concerns that we need to be addressing.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying, because it wasn't really clear what you were getting at. Now that I understand what you're getting at. Well, I guess, you know, one of the things that you have to consider here is, what does this mean for an individual community? I mean, what is going on in the community? What are the potential, you know, focuses and outgrowths of something like this? It depends, you know. I don't think that, you know, personally, from what I've seen, and I've been working on this stuff for a lot of time, I've worked with a lot of communities on a lot of different issues, and a lot of times it gets to be a very singular issue in a given community. You know, from my standpoint, I'd have to have more information in order to tell you exactly what it potentially can mean.
Jay, do you want to respond?
Sure. I would say two things. One is, at this point, coming up to 2025 in bay restoration, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. Every state is at a point now where we are looking at more at heavier lifts, at less impactful projects, but broken up throughout the entire watershed. And so a big part of that is getting into communities that have been ignored throughout this restoration process because they weren't that big bang in sediment and nutrient reduction right away. So in one regard, getting into these EJ communities is a necessary component now that we're cutting down to the bone. I mean, we have to get there. The other part is bay restoration only exists as far as there's political will for it. And we still have so many communities where local water quality is so far removed from swimmable or drinkable, or we have communities where there's still human waste that go into the river on a regular basis, that getting people to think that bay restoration is a good idea is sometimes difficult when you're not willing to go into those communities. And so I think it's also a matter of, if you're committed to this big picture 30,000 foot goal, you need to be in those communities so everybody has some skin in the game. And so I think it's really two-part on why we need to be working more in environmental justice communities at this time.
Let me, I don't mean to ignore the other panelists. I just want to there's a resource question coming up that I want to make sure we at least get on the docket before we have to close. From Ruby Stemme, please tell us what measures are being taken to open accessibility to funding and resources to the diverse and underserved communities we are talking about today. I think, Jay, you talked a lot about that in your presentation. I think Reggie, Jim, Taylor, Jay, you can all probably respond briefly to that. And just to remind people that there are lots of questions coming in, and we will get them answered for you, and the responses turned back out after the webinar.
So I'll just briefly say some of the things that we're doing in Virginia, and that is grant opportunities have traditionally been based on either the ability for a locality to match or the ability to put some kind of capital on the table. And so a big thing that Virginia's been doing is trying to remove those boundaries for participation, and also changing the way our environmental quality issued grants may have debt forgiveness built into it. And so those have been two major tools, and we've seen that in land conservation and water quality efforts, where we're trying to eliminate those barriers to participation, and also send those funders into the communities to directly meet with municipalities.
Taylor, do you actually might have an idea of what are barriers that you've seen to funding?
So I guess this is more of a point about funding in general, which is that even when there is availability of funding, that funding means very little without an existing relationship. Just to go back to the case of Baltimore, that the city had $2 million annually that it was required to hold on to and always have just to pay out to homeowners in the instance of a basement backup. In 2018, they spent $14,000 of that $2 million fund. And so without relationships, without trust, without open communication between regulators, that funding exists and it's important, it needs to be there, but it can't get into communities and it can't do the work that it's meant to. And that was largely because residents didn't trust the city to do anything. They didn't know about the program. They didn't really believe something would happen, and that there were requirements placed on that funding that really cancel a lot of people out, especially since there were time limits, needing to call 311 within some time. So funding is important and it's necessary, and it's the way we get work done, but it can't be the only step that regulators take or that states take in this process. Like Jay said, being in communities and having conversations with communities is the piece that's truly mattered, and it's the only way that we've been able to do this work and do it in any meaningful way where communities felt like we were actually serving a purpose and supporting them in their efforts. And we've changed a lot of our approaches based on talking to communities, and I think that that's a tactic that we all might want to consider adopting.
Either Reggie or Jim, do you have anything you want to add briefly to that before we formally close?
Yeah, sure. You know, we do have some competitive grant programs, the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program and the Collaborative Problem Solving Cooperative Agreements programs, which are competitive. So obviously the funding is limited, and obviously there's going to be, you know, like limitations placed on some of the smaller organizations and some of the neediest organizations because they don't have the resources. So that's going to be something that is a problem, needs to be solved. There needs to be more time spent by folks getting out and doing grant writing workshops and other types of support initiatives to get these types of at-risk organizations and communities involved in helping to get them funded.
Mm-hmm. Jim, anything in closing?
No, just that, you know, the slide I showed you earlier about the EC, the EIJ statement from the Executive Council and them specifically calling out grant targeting in our decision-making and how we allocate our grants. We, you know, 70% of our Bay program budget, 85 million, goes out in the form of grants to states, local governments, and other partners. So we're working right now on revising our grant guidance to consider DEIJ and have the states tell us how they're targeting those funds that they receive from us towards underserved communities. So hopefully that will make a difference over time.
Okay, and with that, I want us to kind of give a silent applause to our panelist members. I greatly appreciate it. Their contact information is up on the screen. I would please implore you to come back on Wednesday, November 18th for our next roundtable. We have a number of EJ related topics we are considering. They've been in the chat box, but if there's something you would like to see explored, please let us know. And with that, I very much appreciate your bravery, humility, and just willingness to engage. And we'll see you hopefully November 18th. And thanks once again to our panelists.